Hello, congregation. I'm going to be your teacher for the next couple of weeks as we start to get into the book of Judges. I spoke to Brad briefly, and he asked me if I would be willing to do this class for a couple of weeks, and so here I am. And as we're looking at the book of Judges, I wanted to just start off with an introduction and looking at chapter 1 this week. Sometimes I try to get a lot more chapters done, but I figured I would go ahead and keep it a little bit shorter this week so that you'd be able to hopefully just start to get into this book, maybe even read ahead, take some notes of your own, and see what kinds of things that you discover as you read the book of Judges. I will say that I read a lot of different commentaries on it, and although the book seems very straightforward as you look at it, there are a lot of things that you can see if you're taking notes, if you're looking very closely at things that are mentioned. There are some different pieces of information that might jump out to you. You might see some different things. So I do encourage you to take notes. I do encourage you to read ahead and to see what you can see. I'm not going to unpack all the different things that the commentaries mentioned. I like to watch a movie and just watch a movie. And then afterwards, I can look at the reviews and say, oh, wait, maybe I missed some things, and then go back and watch the movie again. I don't like to hear everyone talk about the movie and then go watch it, because then the only thing I can think of, the only thing I see is what everyone else has been mentioning from before I got the chance to view it for myself. For that reason, I'm not going to unpack all the different things that the commentaries say. I'm going to bring up some of the different things, but not really hit on all the different intricate things that the commentaries will point out. But I am mentioning to you right now that there are some remarkable parallels between different judges. There are some very interesting things if you are taking notes and if you are looking very closely. So in starting a new book, I think it is very helpful to see where it falls in the progression of God's relationship with mankind. Where does this book fall in the Bible? Well, Judges is the seventh book. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, then Judges. And so we are at a point in time after Israel has come out of Egypt, after the Ten Commandments. Moses has led Egypt, and Moses has led Israel, and now Joshua has led Israel into the promised land. They've had some military victories, and Joshua has been a faithful leader before God. Close to the end of his time there, Joshua says, you decide for yourself who you will serve. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. Israel then responds back, we'll serve God as well. And if you have any other frame of reference to this book, then you know this book was not written to express how amazingly faithful Israel was to God during the time after Joshua. This book is really going to deal a lot with Israel's disobedience. Then they're going to be oppressed. They're going to cry out to God. They're going to repent, and God is going to raise up a judge, a deliverer for Israel. So that's something that's going to happen over and over again. So this is where we are. When Israel is approaching these different cities, you may be familiar with the names of the cities, but remember, this is Israel's first time approaching these cities. They are now taking the city from their previous owners, and they're now taking possession of these cities as they are entering and occupying the promised land. So as we're looking at this, I just want you to remember that we're going to be talking a little bit about the author, the audience, some of the progression of the book, and getting right into that. The author we don't know, but we do have some clues that the author would have probably lived during the reign of David or sometime thereafter. There's a phrase that is mentioned time and again. In those days, Israel had no king. That phrase would be impossible to say if you didn't know that Israel was going to have a king, or if you had not seen how much better things were during the reign of a king like, let's say, David, so that you can compare what they had then to what you had during the time of David. So, as far as what we believe, this would probably have been written and compiled somewhere around the time that David was king over Israel. The audience would have been the Israelites. There's a lot for them to learn. There's a lot for them to learn from generations that came before. And the story of the judges is sort of timeless in its nature. God picks a downtrodden, oppressed people. He frees them from their oppression. He starts a relationship with them where he is their God and they are his people. And he is determined to bless them. He's leading them to a land that is going to be very plentiful. And he's going to bless them there if they would only listen to him. Once the Israelites get into the land, they enjoy the prosperity, they enjoy the blessings, and they begin to lose sight of God being their God, of the fact that they need to obey his commandments, that he is their leader. And so the people start to turn away from God, and they find themselves at odds with God. This is the story as it will be recycled over and over in the book of Judges. And I say it's timeless because I think there are many different ways where this exact same story is recycled in my life, maybe even in your life. One analogy that I'll point out is when I was a campus minister, we had several students who needed a job. Maybe they got fired from one, or maybe they just needed a job to pay for some things. And they would come to some of the different meetings that we had and say, please pray for me to get a job. And so as a group, we would pray, God, we pray that this student would get a job. And then in a couple weeks, they would say, I have a job. And it was a great thing. And we were all very happy for them. And then they let us know, well, I can't make it to any of the meetings anymore. I won't be a part of the fellowship so much, and I won't make it to services because I have a job. And I always found that to be peculiar because they recognized they needed to pray to God. They needed to ask God for help. What they needed to find in a job wasn't something that they could do for themselves. They needed God's help. And then when God helped them and blessed them to have a job, the very first thing they said was, I can't do this stuff and spend this time on God because now I have a job. I think this exact same scenario of human nature is what the Israelites are going through in the book of Judges. So it's very applicable to us today. I think there's a lot that we can learn in the same way that the audience, the Israelites at that point in time, had a lot to learn from the generations that came before them and their relationship with God and how they navigated that, to see the successes and failures so that they could learn more about how they should behave in their own relationship with God. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot that was in the commentaries, but I'm not going to get into all of that. The main progression of this book will go from introduction to the main narrative to a conclusion. The introduction that you would find in chapters 1 and 2 and the beginning of chapter 3 really expresses that bridge between Joshua dying, Israel's behavior, God's response, and then up to the time of the first judge. So we see how Israel is going to respond to their commitment earlier of we will follow God. And we'll see how well that goes. We also see God's response. And one of the things that I wanted to point out, because I think that this really does express so much about what this book will be. If you take a look at this verse right here, I'm sharing it on the screen. Judges chapter 2, verses 14 through 16. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. Whenever Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. Then the Lord raised up judges, who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. So that is sort of in a nutshell what the entire book is going to be talking about. This is going to be the scenario that we see playing itself over and over again. So sort of mentioned that the introduction there, and that's part of that. The main narrative is going to be about 11 different judges. You'll notice that some of them are more faithful than others. Some have very little written about them, and some of the remainder are quite rebellious. And you might look and say, is that really who God chose to be a judge? And this is all sort of wrapped up in that conclusion, because there are some events mentioned in the conclusion which strike a resounding tone with the rest of the book of Judges. Because these final few episodes really reveal that in those days, everyone did as they saw fit. Everyone was their own captain. They weren't listening to one voice for the nation. They were instead deciding for themselves, this is what I see as right, and this is what I will do. And so those are the three sections of the book of Judges. There's more that I could talk about. I don't want to talk about it all. Instead, we can get right to reading. So I'll share with you again this is actually from Bible Gateway, but if you have a Bible, you can go ahead and open up to Judges chapter 1, and we'll start reading there, and we'll pause every so often to just talk about some of the things that we're looking at. Here in chapter 1, verse 1. After the death of Joshua, the Israelites asked the Lord, "Who of us is to go up first to fight against the Canaanites?" The Lord answered, "Judah shall go up. I have given the land into their hands." The men of Judah then said to the Simeonites, their fellow Israelites, "Come up with us into the territory allotted to us to fight against the Canaanites. We in turn will go with you into yours." So the Simeonites went with them. When Judah attacked, the Lord gave the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hands, and they struck down 10,000 men at Bezek. It was there that they found Adoni-Bezek and fought against him, putting to rout the Canaanites and Perizzites. Adoni-Bezek fled, but they chased him and caught him and cut off his thumbs and big toes. Pause. I think that there are certain things that you might read that you just need to process for a second. They cut off his thumbs and big toes. That seems pretty mean. But if you understand the time period that this was and the way that they would take prisoners of war, first off, you didn't want to have someone as a prisoner who could then become a soldier and fight against you or kill you at night or anything like that. So cutting off his thumbs and big toes would have neutralized any fighting potential he had. But even beyond that, and beyond the fact that in this day and age that wouldn't have been completely weird, we're going to see why Adoni-Bezek saw this kind of punishment personally. And there's a bigger reason why he himself experienced this kind of personal humiliation. Verse 7. Then Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings with their thumbs and big toes cut off have picked up scraps under my table. Now God has paid me back for what I did to them. They brought him to Jerusalem, and he died there. The men of Judah attacked Jerusalem also and took it. They put the city to the sword and set it on fire. After that, Judah went down to fight against the Canaanites living in the hill country, the Negev, and the western foothills. They advanced against the Canaanites living in Hebron, formerly called Kiriath Arba, and defeated Sheshai, Ahman, and Talmai. From there they advanced against the people living in Debir, formerly called Kiriath Sefer. So what we're starting to see as we're looking here is that Judah is experiencing a lot of success. God has been with them. And in fact, Israel inquired initially, who should we send first? Send Judah. And God is blessing Judah. This is after the death of Joshua. They still have some more work to do in acquiring the promised land. And God hasn't left them. It wasn't as if Joshua died and God said, that's it, I'm done, you're on your own. God is helping them still. God is still blessing them. And God has sent Judah ahead, and they're experiencing some great triumphs there. And so this next little section is interesting too, because it seems to have been taken directly from the book of Joshua. But it's the section where Caleb is going to be offering his daughter in marriage to anyone who can capture this. But we'll go ahead and read it right here. If you join back in verse 12. And Caleb said, I will give my daughter Achsah in marriage to the man who attacks and captures Kiriath Sepher. Othniel, son of Kenaz, Caleb's younger brother, took it. So Caleb gave his daughter Achsah to him in marriage. One day, when she came to Othniel, she urged him to ask her father for a field. When she got off her donkey, Caleb asked her, what can I do for you? She replied, do me a special favor. Since you have given me land in the Negev, give me also springs of water. So Caleb gave her the upper and lower springs. The descendants of Moses' father-in-law, the Kenite, went up from the city of palms with the people of Judah to live among the inhabitants of the desert of Judah in the Negev near Arad. So here we see all of this success for the tribe of Judah. And if you remember at the very beginning, they promised the Simeonites, if you go with us and help us take our land, we'll go with you and help you take yours. And so that's where we're starting to get in our narrative right now. Then the men of Judah went with the Simeonites, their fellow Israelites, and attacked the Canaanites living in Zephath, and they totally destroyed the city. Therefore it was called Hormah. Judah also took Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron, each city with its territory. The Lord was with the men of Judah. They took possession of the hill country, but they were unable to drive the people from the plains because they had chariots fitted with iron. As Moses had promised, Hebron was given to Caleb, who drove from it the three sons of Anak. Now we're going to pause for just a second here because we see the success that Judah had, and we also see the success that Simeon has with Judah. Give me just a second here. We see the success that the both of them have, but what we're about to get into is a section where we're seeing some of the different tribes not experiencing that same success. So if we jump right back into our reading here, verse 21. The Benjamites, however, did not drive out the Jebusites who were living in Jerusalem. To this day, the Jebusites live there with the Benjamites. Now the tribes of Joseph attacked Bethel, and the Lord was with them. When they sent men to spy out Bethel, formerly called Luz, the spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, show us how to get into the city, and we will see that you are treated well. So he showed them, and they put the city to the sword, but spared the man and his whole family. He then went to the land of the Hittites, where he built a city and called it Luz, which is its name to this day. Now that's very reminiscent of Rahab and what happened with her as she showed kindness to the Israelites. They spared this man and his family for helping them into Bethel. Verse 27. But Manasseh did not drive out the people of Beth Shan, or Tanakh, or Dor, or Iblim, or Megiddo, and their surrounding settlements, for the Canaanites were determined to live in the land. When the Israelites became strong, they pressed the Canaanites into forced labor, but never drove them out completely. Nor did Ephraim drive out the Canaanites living in Gezer, but the Canaanites continued to live there among them. Neither did Zebulun drive out the Canaanites living in Kitron or Nahalal. So these Canaanites lived among them, but Zebulun did subject them to forced labor. Nor did Asher drive out those living in Akko or Sidon or Ahlab or Akzib or Helba or Aphek or Rehob. The Asherites lived among the Canaanite inhabitants of the land because they did not drive them out. Neither did Naphtali drive out those living in Beth Shemesh or Beth Anath. But the Naphtalites, too, lived among the Canaanite inhabitants of the land. And those living in Beth Shemesh and Beth Anath became forced laborers for them. The Amorites confined the Danites to the hill country, not allowing them to come down into the plain. And the Amorites were determined also to hold out in Mount Heres, Aijalon, and Shalbim. But when the power of the tribes of Joseph increased, they too were pressed into forced labor. The boundary of the Amorites was from the Scorpion Pass to Selah and beyond. So, in reading that, there are several tribes who are mentioned. The tribes who have been mentioned are Judah and Simeon. They both received a lot of success. We also see Zebulun, Dan, Naphtali, Asher, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh. And they all did not completely drive out the people from in front of them, which is a very interesting thing, because when you see the success that Judah had, and you see that Simeon also shared in that success, then the next question is, why couldn't these other tribes also share in that same success? Wasn't God still with them? Now, we haven't yet gotten to the point where God responds to Israel and where we see more of what Israel is doing. But from what we already see, we know that this isn't what God wanted. God intended for Israel to go into this land, to drive out the inhabitants from before them, and to take possession of the land. Instead, what we see here is the tribes are recognizing that they're powerful, and instead of completely driving them out, they're keeping them around to force them to do their laborious work. They're trying to keep slaves. Rather than obeying God, they have a plan B that they think, this is a pretty good plan, and maybe we should go with this. I was curious as I read it, and so I took some notes to notice that Levi is not mentioned, Reuben is not mentioned, Gad is not mentioned, nor is Issachar. Now, Reuben and Gad are on the other side of the Jordan. Levi does not have a land of inhabitants there among the tribes, and Issachar, for whatever reason, just was not mentioned there. And I might realize why that is sometime later. But for now, I just noticed that those were not mentioned. The people who are living here at this time, the Israelites, they are not the same group that came out of Egypt. That generation is dead and gone. They have not seen the miracles or the punishment that happened while they were wandering in the wilderness. This group, some of them may have been with Joshua as they first entered the promised land and started to take possession of it. But many of them just have not known the trials or the hardships. And they're taking for advantage the fact that God is on their side, or maybe they're not even thinking about God being on their side. Maybe they're thinking, we've generated this own good fortune ourselves. And so their behavior is not obedient to God, nor is it honoring to God. Their behavior is such that they're ignoring that God even has a role to play in everything that's going on. We see, if you look back at the Ten Commandments, as you take a look back at the law, God has a lot of blessings prepared for his people. But there is also sections in Leviticus If you want to take a look at chapter 26, verses 14 through 45, and also Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 15 through 68, where God says, if you don't keep to my commandments, these are the things that will happen to you. And rather than choosing to live in God's blessing, Israel is living, or is about to live, into the curses that God said beforehand. In that opening verse that we read in chapter 2, verses 14 through 16, we do see that God told them that that's what he was going to do. And that's exactly what will come to pass. My hope as we continue to read in Judges is that just like to the Israelites to whom this was written, we could learn from the example of that generation of Israelites, see their successes, see their failures, and not repeat in the same folly. That we could stay out of this cycle that they are getting themselves into. And that instead of needing to have God's discipline, when we're blessed, that we can continue to honor God, that we can continue to view God and respond to God as being our Lord and our God, and keep living in those blessings, rather than get into a good time of being in a great country with a lot of great blessings and adopting the behavior and the gods of the people in the land in which we're living, and then living at odds with God. So my hope is that as we continue to read, that we can see a lot of these parallels, that we can learn from a lot of them. I do hope that as you are watching this today, that you're blessed, and I hope that you come back for the next class as we get into chapter 2 and we start to get into the main narratives of some of those judges. I hope you're having a blessed evening, and I'll see you Sunday. Good night.